Welcome to another edition of In the Spotlight, brought to you by Crimson Cloak Publishing, the earth-friendly publisher with books for both adults and children in a wide variety of genres, available in paperback and hardcover, as ebooks and with some audiobooks as well. In the Spotlight is a wide-ranging weekly interview show with authors, entrepreneurs, professionals, and other experts. Your host is Cynthia McGregor. Opinions and views expressed by the guests or hosts on this show do not necessarily reflect the opinions and views of the creator, Crimson Cloak Radio, the network, the hosts, or sponsors. And now, here's Cynthia.
Thank you, Carly McCracken, and welcome everyone to another edition of In the Spotlight. My first guest this week is April Young Bennett, who began studying the lives of suffragists to inform her own activism. She has campaigned for better state and federal laws that affect children and families. She has been addressing the wage gap, health care, education, and juvenile justice, and also she is trying to get laws that will give gender equity within her modern-day patriarchal religious community. Yes, she told me before we went on the air she lives in Salt Lake City, so I can understand why she wrote that in her bio. As an organizer for the activist organization Ordained Women, right on, she led hundreds of women and men in marches and demonstrations that attracted national attention. April helps feminists of different faiths share ideas and collaborate toward common goals at the Religious Feminism podcast. She blogs about Mormon feminism at Exponent 2, an organization that began during the second wave feminist movement that is named after a 19th century Mormon suffragist newspaper. April is here to talk about the fact that a new, more diverse generation of feminists is raising questions about how to effect change in her new book, Ask a Suffragist, Stories and Wisdom from America's First Feminists. Modern-day feminist activist April Young Bennett channels the wisdom of the first generation of American feminists as exemplars and advisors to help us find solutions relevant to our modern world. Welcome, April.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
April, the first question I want to ask you is, how does a suffragist differ from a suffragette?
Yeah, lots of people ask me that. Why didn't I call it Ask a Suffragette? I actually would have loved to call it Ask a Suffragette because, for me at least, suffragette is so much easier to pronounce without sounding like I have a lisp. But the reason I called it Ask a Suffragist is because this book is about American suffragists. And here in the United States of America, that's what they called themselves. They called themselves suffragists. The word suffragette was mostly used in England. And so, honoring the way they spoke about themselves, I call themselves suffragists, just like they called themselves. One thing I do like about that word is that it's gender neutral, because there were lots of men who were involved in the suffragist movement.
Would you like to tell us about that?
You bet. Some of the most famous are William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. These men, they're most known for being abolitionists, but they were also strong proponents of women's rights. And part of the reason that they were such strong proponents of women's rights is because they cared about abolishing slavery, and they realized that they couldn't do it alone, that they needed the help of women to bring about this great cause. And at the time, women were barred from speaking in public. They were barred from most professions. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. There were so many ways in which women were restricted that it made it harder for them to participate in the abolitionist movement. And so people like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass realized that we need women, and in order for women to really be true partners with us, we need to stop all these restrictions on them.
Now, you're an activist. What impelled you to write a history book?
Yeah, that's a little unusual, isn't it? I actually didn't start out writing a history book. I started out researching the suffrage movement just because I wanted to inform my own activism. I wanted to be a better activist. I was noticing that things were happening to me that kind of reminded me of things I knew about from history. For example, there was one time when I led a large group of women to march to a religious meeting that was men only. And when we arrived there, they did not let us enter. But they said, here's what we'll do as a compromise. We'll let you stand outside in the rain and listen over the internet so you can hear what's going on. You just can't participate.
Oh.
Right. So that reminded me a lot of something that happened to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. When they attended the World Anti-Slavery Society convention in London in 1840, they were barred from the meeting. They said they wanted to come in, and they tried to come in anyway, and they said, we're not going to let you in, but here's what we'll do. We'll let you sit in the balcony behind a bar and a curtain so you can hear what's going on. You just can't participate. And so this is something that was very similar to what happened to me, and I realized I need to know more about how people have already handled these situations, and I need to learn from those people who've already been through it.
How is Ask a Suffragist different from a traditional history textbook or biography?
One of the biggest differences is that it's written by an activist for activists. So I'm less concerned with things that might concern, say, a history professor, like maybe genealogy or meeting minutes or things like that. I'm more concerned with things that are pertinent to activists, like how do we build relationships? How do we change people's hearts and minds? How do we collaborate with people who are different from us? So I'm worried about those kinds of things, and that's the focus of my book. In my book, each chapter begins with a question that I would love to ask our feminist foremothers and other forebears if I could. Questions that, like, how do we make our voices heard? How do we balance our personal lives with our activism? Things that I would just like to pick the brains of those people who came before me about. And each chapter focuses on examples from the lives of these great people and how they handled those questions, what they did.
How did you choose the suffragists you featured in the book?
I tried to get a wide range. Another thing that's difficult about biographies, as much as I love biographies, when you read a biography, you read about one person is the main focus, and it kind of seems like everyone else revolves around them in the world. But as a real-life activist, I know that activism rarely works like that. Movements are not built by solitary heroes. They're actually built by very diverse people who have different ideas and different backgrounds. And so I wanted my book to talk about many different people who were different from each other, who approached activism in different ways, who came from different economic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, many of whom were immigrants to the United States, so even their countries were different from each other, so that I could see lots of different perspectives and see how these people managed to work together, even though they were so different from each other.
April, how did the American women's rights movement begin?
The movement began largely as an offshoot of the abolition movement and another movement that was going on at the time, the temperance movement. During this time, women really cared about abolishing slavery, as they should, of course. And they also cared about temperance because at that time, alcoholism was a real women's issue. Most of the alcoholics were men. And at the time, it was very difficult for a woman to get a divorce. It was, if somebody was a child of somebody who was an alcoholic father, it was unlikely that anyone was going to intervene and take that person to social services. Domestic violence was just winked at. So for these women, if they lived with a violent alcoholic, there was very little they could do about it. And so combating alcoholism was very important to them. So they wanted to abolish slavery, they wanted to combat alcoholism, and those were their first priorities before they even thought about women's rights. But then they found that they could not support the causes they believed in because they didn't have rights. So if they tried to speak in public, people would shout them down and say that wasn't a woman's place. They couldn't vote for the elected officials who were making the laws that supported slavery and made it possible for alcoholism to be so prevalent. And there were lots of other things that they needed money for, really. Susan B. Anthony said, "Woman needs a purse of her own." And she said that after she became so frustrated because there were women who supported causes that she cared about, like abolition and temperance. And they tried to organize societies, but they ran out of money so quickly because they weren't allowed to hold jobs and their men owned all of the property for the family, and they just didn't have access to the funds they needed. So they realized if they were going to support these causes they cared about, they needed to fight for their own rights.
Well, you've just mentioned some of the barriers that suffragists had to confront. What were some of the others?
I think one of the biggest ones was there was a big taboo at the time when the women's rights movement began against women speaking in public in front of men. It was considered improper for a woman to stand up and give a political speech in a room where men were listening. It was okay for a woman to, say, meet with other women in their parlors and talk to them, but they weren't supposed to talk to men. Meanwhile, men, of course, could talk to everyone. So this was a big barrier, and it was enforced by society at the time. If a woman did try to get up and give a speech, they would shout her down. They would try to make her stop. They did not want to listen to women giving speeches in front of men. And so this was probably the very first barrier they had to overcome before they could accomplish anything.
And yet they didn't mind men giving speeches in front of women. Good old double standard.
Oh, yeah, it was quite the double standard, one of many.
Well, how did women of color contribute to the American suffrage movement?
Women of color actually began the women's suffrage movement. The very first woman we have on record to break that taboo was a woman of color. Her name was Maria W. Stewart. And she was the first woman that we know of back in the 1830s who had actually announced in newspapers that she was going to give a speech, and both men and women were invited to attend. It made everyone mad. Nobody was happy with it. The speech was not well received, but she did it. She got up, she gave a speech, she talked about the need to abolish slavery, she talked about the need for women's rights, and she talked about the need to address poverty and to improve educational opportunities. And although her speeches were not well received at the time, she was shouted down, people tried to stop her, people threw things at her. In spite of that, one of the great things that happened as a result of her giving those speeches was she eventually delivered them to William Lloyd Garrison, who published them in newspapers. And then they became very influential. People started reading her speeches and thinking about what she had to say. And so that's really, in a large manner, how it began. Some other very early women to participate in the movement were the women of the Fortin and Purvis families. This was a big family, lots of intermarriage between the Fortins and the Purvises, so there were a lot of people in this family that was a family of color, and they lived in Philadelphia. And they originally became involved in the abolition movement, but after a while, they expanded their platform to include women's rights because they realized that it was very difficult to fight for abolition while so many people were trying to block them because they were women.
Well, now, how did immigrants contribute to the American suffrage movement?
Some of those great suffragists, the greatest American suffragists that we talk about, were immigrants from other countries. One really good example is Ernestine Rose. And Ernestine Rose was Polish. And before she came to America, she spent some time in England. And in both of those countries, she got some great ideas that she brought with her when she came to the United States that really affected her activism when she got here. For example, when she was in Poland, she had an experience where she had to fight for her property rights. She was engaged against her will, betrothed to a local man, as was the custom in her local town. And she did not want to go through with this marriage. And the person that she was betrothed to said, well, even if you don't go through with the marriage, I'm going to keep your property, your inheritance, because that is my right as your betrothed. And so she actually went to court when she was only 17 years old and fought this man, and she won. And that passion she had for women's property rights, she brought with her when she came to the United States. And when she got here to the United States, she found that women's property rights really weren't much better here. In many ways, they were worse. And so she started petitioning for women to have property rights, for women to own their own property, for it not to belong to their husbands just because they were married. And she was one of the first women to do that.
How was activism during the 19th century different from modern activism, and how was it similar?
The biggest difference was the technology. It was harder back then because they didn't have the internet, they didn't have podcasts, they didn't have radio and TV. So they had to work a little bit harder to spread the word. And so that was different. But at the same time, most of the important things about activism were the same. They still needed to find ways to make their voices heard. They needed to change people's minds. They needed to lobby. They needed to work with allies and develop allies. And so a lot of what they did, if we actually learn about it, we can get some great tips from them that are still applicable today.
How should modern activists emulate suffragists, and what pitfalls should they avoid?
What they did best and what they did worst, I think, are kind of interrelated. One of the best things that they did is, because there were so few of them at the time, my book talks about the very beginning of the suffrage movement, when the people who actually believed in women's rights were few and far between. So because there were so few of them, they had to learn how to get along. So they had to work with people who were different from them, and that diversity only helped the movement. Unfortunately, diversity also became something that kind of became a barrier between them as time went on. There was a time when white women and black men were kind of competing against each other to be the first to have voting rights. And whenever you start competing against or fighting against another disadvantaged group, I feel like you're losing. So I think that's something that we need to be careful about as we look at our movements today. Make sure that as much as we care about our own personal pet causes, that we aren't doing anything that would block another disadvantaged group.
April, do you have either a funny story or a heartwarming story connected to your book or to the movement that you'd like to share with us?
I would like to tell you about another experience that I had that kind of reminded me of the suffrage movement way back several years ago when I was new to activism, and it was when I was working within religious activism. I'm a Mormon, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we have a tradition within our church that women wear dresses on Sundays to church. It's not a rule, it's not required, it's just a tradition, something that women usually do. And several years ago, several women who were interested in women's rights and improving equality within the church decided to have a very peaceful demonstration in which we demonstrated our desire to be equals within our church with men by doing something unusual, wearing pants to church all at once on the same day. And it got a lot of attention, some negative attention. There was one person, at least, who actually threatened to shoot anyone who appeared at his local congregation wearing any woman who appeared in pants. And so that was a little bit scary, but for the most part, it did get a lot of attention. And I am happy to report that very recently, some other rules that we have within our church about women wearing skirts. For example, when I was a missionary within my church, and at that time, women were required to wear dresses, even when riding bikes. It was ridiculous. Yeah, it was ridiculous. We looked so silly. We used to try to knot them up in big diapers or something so that we could not get them in the spokes and wouldn't trip. It was so silly. And there's this rule that went on for years, and we could not convince the men in charge to change this rule. And I'm relieved to say that very recently they finally eliminated that rule. Now you will see female Mormon missionaries wearing pants, riding their bikes much more safely. But one of the things that it made me think about with the suffrage movement was there was a time when the women in the 1850s decided that they were going to do a dress reform movement. They were going to say, we as women have a right to wear pants. At that time, all women pretty much wore long dresses, some of them with trains. They wore corsets and petticoats. It was a very impractical outfit. Wearing that kind of an outfit, there were many professions they couldn't participate in just because they were dressed wrong. And even everyday life could be a little bit dangerous because they used a lot of fire. They cooked on the hearth and they carried candles. Those things would light on fire if you dropped a candle. So they were absolutely right that, of course, women should be allowed to wear pants. And they started this movement, and it became very important to them. And they worked hard at it, but it was difficult. They ran into a lot of barriers. Men just went crazy. They had street harassment wherever they went. Men were following them around, making fun of them because they were wearing bloomers. Sometimes they were blocking them from walking down the street so they couldn't get around. And they found that while in the past it had always been difficult to give speeches during this time in front of men, that there were always hecklers, they found that everywhere they went all the time, if they were dressed in pants, they had that same problem. There were hecklers everywhere. They never had a moment of peace, a moment of rest. And so the dress reform movement was something that in the end they decided to let go of because there were other things that were more important. But I do like to think back to them when I look at my modern experience with our Wear Pants to Church Day, and it reminds me of those great women who participated in the Bloomers movement.
Well, I'd like to talk to you more about your work to get women ordained, but I want to hear a passage from your book first. So let's make sure we get that taken care of.
Oh, let's do that. Okay. So I think I'm going to read for you the story of when Lucy Stone, who was one of the most famous suffragists of her time, met Harry Blackwell, who later on became her husband. I just think it's fun to actually look back in the past and see what their day-to-day lives were like, what very intimate moments were like. And it's been a great privilege that I've been able to read their diaries, read their letters, and kind of get a glimpse into what day-to-day life was like for these important activists. So I'm going to share with you the moment that, not when Harry met Sally, but when Harry met Lucy. Harry Blackwell met Lucy Stone. The first time Henry Blackwell surprised Lucy Stone at the back door, she was dressed in bloomers, the revolutionary but unflattering uniform of women's rights activists of her time. Of all the awkward positions to be in while meeting one's soulmate, she was standing on the kitchen table, painting the ceiling. Henry, who went by the nickname Harry, came armed with a letter of introduction from Lucy's abolitionist mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote it only after warning Harry that courting Lucy would be futile. Lucy declined Harry's offer to help paint, but did let him peel the potatoes, a task he performed poorly. In her distraction, Lucy did no better with the carrots, forgetting to peel them before she chopped them up. Harry had dazzling white teeth, which may have been a natural reward for abstention from slave-produced tobacco. The Blackwells were an abolitionist family. Harry had 5 sisters who were all trailblazers, particularly Elizabeth, the first American woman to earn a medical degree. The pair went for a walk outside. Harry beguiled Lucy with sweet nothings about how women should be allowed to preach, edit newspapers, practice medicine, law, and surgery, carry on business, and do every other human thing. Caught off guard by the effect this eloquent stranger had on her, and not fully in touch with her own hormones, Lucy accused Harry of hypnotizing her. It was the only explanation she could come up with for that strange, giddy feeling she had in his presence. This romantic interlude came to an abrupt stop when Harry proposed marriage, a move that may have been a bit too forward for a first date.
That's wonderful. You had me grinning.
Yeah, it's so much fun to look back and actually kind of be like a spy, kind of eavesdropping on their personal conversations and see how they learned and grew together.
That's wonderful. Let me make sure that our listeners know where to buy your book. First of all, it's called Ask a Suffragist. Second, let me spell suffragist for anyone who isn't sure. It's SUFFRAGIST, suffragist. Your website is https https://askasuffragist.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is there anywhere else that listeners can buy your book?
Absolutely. It's available wherever good books are sold. If you do want to visit askasuffragist.com, there's links there to find it at your local bookstore or at Amazon, as you prefer. It's available in different formats. We have a large print edition available. I myself am very nearsighted, so I understand that some people can't see their books very well, and that's important to me to make it accessible. So it's available in large print. It's available in regular print. There's a Kindle book available, and at any moment now, the audiobook will appear on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.
Is it available through your publisher? And if so, who is your publisher?
The publisher is Brown Blackwell Books. And you can find it, probably the best way to find it is to go to askasuffragist.com, because then you can link through to all the different places that sell it.
Now, in the 4 minutes that we have left, would you like to tell me about your work getting women ordained?
Absolutely. I started off talking about women's rights actually that's where I began becoming an activist, was I really cared about improving rights for women within their religious communities, and particularly within my religious community. I'm a Mormon, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and in my church, all men are ordained to the priesthood and no women are. So every male person, when they turn 12, is ordained to the priesthood. It creates a hierarchy in which virtually every man in the church has a higher rank than every woman. And so it is very concerning. It does lead to side effects where there are policy choices made within my church that benefit men to the exclusion of women. I don't know that it's always intentional. It's just because they don't have women at the table, and so they don't know what they're doing necessarily. And so I became involved. I was one of the original people to begin a movement called the Ordained Women Movement. And I was among many activists that worked to kind of raise awareness of the need to ordain women within our church. And we did so many different things. We did marches, we did demonstrations, we did community art projects, social media campaigns. We've done so much to try to raise awareness of the need for equality within our church. And since being involved in that, I've expanded my efforts. I now host a podcast called the Religious Feminism Podcast, which hosts women from many different religious communities. We've talked to Islamic women, Jewish women, people from other Christian traditions about what they are doing to increase equality within their own faith. And it's been exciting to see that there are so many people out there who care about this issue, who are working towards change.
I happen to be an ordained minister myself. I'm a member of the New Thought movement, and in our church, I am not the minister of a church at this time, but I'm on the board of and belong to a metaphysical church, and that is not how I'm ordained New Thought, which is the umbrella over metaphysical and unity and science of mind. In our church, as in the Unity Church that I previously belonged to, there are more women ministers than male ministers.
That's wonderful. I found that I've talked to some people on my podcast, within churches that do ordain women, and for many of them, they still have a long way to go, because even though women are allowed to be ordained, they still find that the vast majority of their ministers are male. And even though technically women are allowed to be ministers within their faith, there aren't so many who are getting that opportunity. And so it's exciting to hear that about your faith.
Yes, it's exciting to be part of it. Well, April Young Bennett, thank you very much for being on the show. I have to take a commercial break now before I bring on my next guest. But God bless you, and I hope your efforts succeed. And good luck with your book.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Take care. Bye-bye now. And we'll be right back with our next guest after this message from our sponsor, who is Crimson Cloak Publishing. Crimson Cloak brings out books in a wide variety of genres, fiction and nonfiction for adults and for children. This week, we're featuring a book that just came out, Mama's Map. It's the second in a series of books by Cindy Handley Godot in the Princess Jellybean series. Princess Jellybean, you may wonder? Yes, meow, she's a cat. And it's illustrated by Sangamitra Dasgupta. And it's, as I say, the second in a series. And there will be more. And it's by, again, Cindy Handley Godot, and it's the Princess Jellybean. She spells it Jellibean, Princess Jellybean series. I'm now going to connect with our next guest. Hold on. Lori, are you there?
I am here. How are you?
I am well, thank you. How are you? Are you well?
Oh, yeah. We're enjoying a nice, cool summer here in Las Vegas.
We're enjoying a hot one here in South Florida. Folks, that's Lori Piotrowski, and Lori Piotrowski holds a master's degree in Romance languages from Ohio State University, but only recently has she used it in the classroom at the College of Southern Nevada, where she teaches Spanish. Hablas español entonces, qué bueno. And sometimes, and sometimes Portuguese, which I don't speak. She is a Renaissance woman of varied careers, beginning in publishing, moving into corporate communications, architectural photography, and public relations. Wow, that is a diverse portfolio. As a young girl, Lori's interest in reading was encouraged by her parents, who would turn off the TV and read every night. She watched their library grow and began her own private library by saving her allowance to buy books through the Scholastic Reader program at school. In college, she joined the Book of the Month Club to create a more adult library. The first book she bought was Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking, which she still uses regularly. Her favorite day of the week is Friday, when she can leave all cares behind and curl up in an easy chair with a good read. I hope you're reading some Crimson Cloak books. And Lori, I understand that you'd like to focus on research. As an author of historical fiction, sometimes the idea of where to begin is overwhelming, so you want to share some of the resources you've discovered, as well as talk about how much is too much research. Let's start with a question about that. How much is too much research?
That's a very good question, and I think it's one that's kind of difficult to answer because it depends on what your topic is. However, if you find yourself researching, or especially on online when we start surfing, and pretty soon, like the commercial says, you're surfing, or you're searching for surfing dogs instead of a vacation rental. When you're completely off topic, you know that you've gone a little bit too far. But where this is important relating to your book is what is the topic and what do you need to learn? I found that often if I make a list of what it is that I really need to learn before I start researching, it helps me hone back in on what's really important.
And how did you choose the period of history that you're writing about?
I'm writing about the American Revolution and actually the period right before that. My first book, Revolutionary Heart, picks up in 1765, just as the Stamp Act and Quartering Acts have been named. And then we're progressing through in book 2, Revolutionary Spirit, picks up a little bit after that and goes into just when the Townshend Acts are announced. And now I'm working on the third in the trilogy called Revolutionary Spark, and that will take us up through the Boston Massacre.
And I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that when I started researching, I'd always heard, well, write what you know. And since this was my favorite period of history, I'd read about it for years and figured, oh, well, I know everything I need to know, until I actually started having to describe things. And then I found out that there was quite a lot that I didn't know. I knew what the people wore. I mean, we've all seen the movies and we recognize the dress as being from that time. But all of a sudden it's like, well, what's that funny shower cap-like thing on her head called? Things like that I didn't know. And then what did they eat? How did they cook? What did they decorate their houses like? What were the streets like? And pretty soon I realized I didn't know anything. And so that's what really got me started on researching.
So what I wanted to ask you is, these books are historical fact or historical fiction?
Historical fiction with an awful lot of fact. One of the things that I started doing is I actually have footnotes in my books, because I knew early on that one of the ways I wanted to drive the storyline was through historical newspapers. And so I literally spent one summer reading newspapers on microfiche, trying to get a feel for what people were going through at the time. And I found quite a little bit of information there that nobody really knows about. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to include some of these things that we don't know that actually happened in my story? And so I would footnote those.
And do you write about other periods of history as well, or are you specializing in the period around the Revolution?
At the moment, I'm working solely on the American Revolution, but I do have a couple of children's books out because I was so interested in American history. I thought it would be kind of fun to do some little things for like 7- and 8-year-olds about American history, traditions, and things like that. So I have two of those books out. Wrigley Celebrates Thanksgiving, which talks about Thanksgiving. We always think about the Pilgrims, but more about how did it actually become a real holiday. And then the second one is Wrigley Rolls and Easter Egg, where we talk about the White House Easter egg roll. And most of us just kind of, we look for the photo on Tuesday morning, but how did that even start? And that was a funny one to learn about, because it was actually a truly grassroots event started by children in the 1800s in Washington, D.C.
And how did you know when you were done researching, if you really got into it and really got caught up in researching? How did you know when you were done?
That's a good question too, because sometimes you really aren't ever done. But what you need to do is stick to your outline and what do you need to include. Never throw the research away, because it might be useful later on. But I also think that even if you over-research, what it's done is given you an in-depth feel for the period that you're writing about, and I think your writing will reflect that. But editing is key there, because it's real easy to start including things that you really don't need to.
Where are your favorite places to go for information?
Oh, I have lots. But one of my favorites that I love to tell people about is the Library of Congress. I had heard years ago that they were starting to put everything online. And when I realized I wanted to include some of the newspapers from the time period, I figured, well, those would be online as well. So I went to loc.gov, and lo and behold, those aren't online. But at that website, they had a little link. It says Ask a Librarian. So I clicked on it, and I told them what I was doing and what I was looking for. And I really hoped, Cynthia, that they would come back and say, well, you really need to come to Washington, D.C., to the Library of Congress reading room and sit amongst all these beautiful paintings and books to get the newspapers. And instead, I got an email the very next day, and she says, well, we have a repository of those at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Library. Is that near to you? And lo and behold, it's like 5 miles from my house. So I got lucky there. But I also found that the more you talk to people about what you're doing, what your topic is, you never know how they can help you. When I started talking to people, I found out I had a lot of friends who were members of an organization called the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they started telling me their stories of their ancestors and things like that, and gave me a whole new avenue to research, and it was invaluable.
Well, what other roadblocks did you experience while researching, besides finding out that the books you wanted weren't online at the Library of Congress?
I found a wonderful resource, and I was so excited about it. And I realized that there was no way I could ever access it. It was at a private library, and there was just no way that I could ever get to it. So I had to do a workaround. And one of the workarounds that I discovered is that I'm fortunate because I live in a city that has, several institutes of higher learning, and most public universities and colleges will give anybody access to their stacks and things like this. But also you can request a library card from them. And once you have the library card, and depending on the university, you can do an interlibrary loan request. And so that means that if they don't have the book there, they can request the book from, say, the University of Pittsburgh or something like that, and they'll ship it down, and then you can check it out for a period of time and then return it back, and they'll ship it back for you. So you can work around that way, and that was invaluable.
Do you have any tips, Lori, for authors who are listening to the show regarding research?
I do, and actually, if they were to write me, I have a cheat sheet that they can request. But lots of the tips that I have, create your topic list before you start researching. What do you need to know? I needed to know clothing, food, decor, but also started to end up realizing I need to know how to make black powder. So I'm probably on the FBI watch list now because I Googled how to make black powder. But also look into different organizations that might be able to help you. Like I found out about the DAR, but there are also others that in your particular area, perhaps it's cooking or something like that. But Meetup online has meetups, organizations, and people that are interested in the same thing. I found a local author here whose husband was a member of a group, and all they do is research into historical firearms. So again, talk to people. And like I said, if they drop me a note on my website, I'd be happy to send them my list of tips.
Let me stop asking you questions momentarily and give out that website. It's also where your books are available. It's www.Lori Piotrowski, that's Lori, P as in Peter, I as in ice cream, O as in olive, T as in Thomas, R as in Roberta, O as in olive, W as in washing machine, S as in Sam, K as in Kate, I as in ice cream, .com. And that's where to go for your books as well as for the cheat sheet, right?
That's right. That's right.
Now, getting back to my questions, which is more problematic for you, researching or writing?
The writing, definitely. I've always loved researching, but writing was difficult. I spent most of my career writing factual things, and one day I was, I guess, complaining to my mom on the phone. I said, I'm just at a dead stop. I don't know what to do. And she says, Lori, you're writing fiction. You can make it up. and that was my aha moment. Yes, Mom, thank you for reminding me.
Did research change your storyline or help you develop it?
It actually helped me quite a bit. When I was reading the newspapers, I learned lots of different things. For example, one of the things I learned was that they were accepting all sorts of currency at the time. We didn't really have a U.S. dollar or anything like that, of course. But they would accept British coin, Flemish, Spanish. And one of the things that I learned when I saw that was it made me look, because I had seen an ad for a demonstration on electricity. And this was in 1765. And I was like, well, the only thing I really know about electricity at that time is Ben Franklin and the kite and the key, and who knows if that's even true, right? But here they were doing a demonstration. And so I researched a little bit about that and then included it as a marvelous little way to entertain my readers, but also educate them in things that perhaps they didn't realize at the time that were going on.
Well, Lori, if they didn't have American currency at the time, when was American currency developed? When did the first dollar roll off the printing press?
Oh, not until we became a nation. So it was a good 20 years away. Mm-hmm. They in Boston at the time, they weren't even allowed to print any sort of money. And so you had people trading in silver spoons and things like that. It was a very interesting time. Business people, merchants, they would have separate tills for the currencies.
Lori, would you read us a passage from one of your books?
Oh, I would love to. Thank you for asking. This is the opening part of Revolutionary Heart. Droplets of cool amber ale spattered white breeches as tankards clattered to the floor. Tears stung my eyes, and my cheeks burned brightly as I stooped to gather them. Tray too heavy, my dear, or do you enjoy spilling ale on an officer of His Majesty's army? I slammed the fifth tankard onto the platter and rose to meet my opponent. Yes, and I'll do it again if you continue to touch me. I felt a slight pressure on my right shoulder, and my mid-calf length petticoat swirled as I turned that direction, my left hand poised to strike. A young redcoat caught my hand mid-air with his right, and with his left placed the last pewter tankard on the wooden tray stained dark from sloshed alcohol. Please disregard my friend's liberties. Your father's good ale has affected his judgment. His soft manner of speech stunned me, and as his blue eyes smiled down at me, suddenly I felt foolish. I blushed as I felt his strong yet gentle grasp encircling my wrist, and I slowly extracted it and averted my eyes, mumbling, "Yes, sir," and quickly left to refill the tankards. Of all the soldiers to run into, this particular lieutenant had been spending a lot of time at the tavern, and I had watched him from afar. Our interactions had been minimal, but his countenance was nice to look at, and more often than not, my eyes would hesitate there before continuing on as I surveyed which of the customers required my presence. None of the redcoats had ever been kind to me before. What makes him different from the others, I wondered. Be careful who you fraternize with, Lieutenant, slurred the drunken officer. These barmaids aren't worthy of your attentions. We're here to do the king's work. Lieutenant Geoffrey Canfield nodded once and said, Yes, sir, you're right, and shook his head in agreement. I shan't forget our purpose here is to ensure loyalty to His Highness the King. I was sure I could feel his eyes follow me to the back of the tavern, which flustered me. I dropped a mug on the floor when I reached the bar, which made me blush even more, and I turned to face the wall to hide my embarrassment. In a short while, I returned to the table and quietly placed a tankard at each man's elbow. My cheeks were still heated, and I'm sure they retained their tinge of rose from the previous encounter with the soldiers. And that was written probably 30 years before I wrote the book.
Well,
Just one of those things. Started earlier and they got a late start. So.
Lori, do you have either a heartwarming or a funny incident to share with my listeners?
I do, and this one caught me totally by surprise. When I started writing, I imagined that I was writing for middle-aged women. You know, they kind of like a little bit of romance, a little bit of adventure. And so that's who I had in mind. But I found out that I have a lot of men readers as well. And I ran into an elderly gentleman, and we were talking. And he says, Lori, I have to apologize to you. And I said, oh, well, why? And he says, well, I haven't finished your book yet. And so I was expecting to hear something very negative. But then he turned it around and he said, I don't have much time to read, but every time I pick up the book, I keep falling in love with Molly over and over again. And Molly, of course, is my main character. So.
Changing topics a moment, you mentioned Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking in your bio. And,
yes.
I wonder, are you a cooking enthusiast as I am, or do you just enjoy reading about it, as I know some people do?
I actually do enjoy cooking. I was a member of 4-H for years, and so I grew up doing all those different classes. But I really do enjoy cooking. It's lots of fun. But I also enjoy reading the cookbooks. My husband's always saying, you have hundreds of cookbooks. Well, I probably only have about 50. But just the same, I have lots of cookbooks from around the world. I've got European, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Greek, Italian, Indian. I have cookbooks from, I guess you'd call them historical cookbooks from the Sephardic Jews. I have one called Unmentionable Cuisine from the Roman period in Italy. And it's interesting because those are also historical tomes that I learned from. In fact, Cynthia, you'll get a kick out of this. I actually bought a cookbook once about cookies because it contained the first American cookie made in the American colonies. And so actually in my book, Revolutionary Spirit, I have Molly make those cookies.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
Oh, I really like to bake. So I'm always looking for new things like that to bake. And there is a wonderful recipe out of Bon Appetit, and it calls for 3 pounds of chocolate. A pound of chocolate in the cake, a pound in the filling, and then another pound to decorate it.
Oh, my word.
That's definitely a death by chocolate.
I'm not a baker at all. I love to cook, but I'm not at all a baker. Tell us a
Yeah.
little more about your children's books while we still have a few minutes.
Sure. Like I said, I've got 2 books in Wrigley Raccoon, and literally she's a Wrigley Raccoon super reader, and she is a project from the National Federation of Republican Women. I serve as their literacy chair, and we're just trying to get kids to reading. I teach at the college level, and these days I have students who are trying to take a foreign language and they can't read in English, and it just makes me so sad. So that's one. And then I had so much fun doing the Wrigley books that I actually wrote a Christmas story about 2 rescued kittens that we got last year, Caesar and Cleo. And that's called Caesar and Cleo Find the Perfect Christmas Tree.
Ah, perfect Christmas tree.
They are perfect. We love them very much.
And again, your books are available at www.loripiotrowski, LORIPIOTROWSKI.com. Right?
And also, yes, and also on Amazon and Goodreads as well. So,
what about your publisher? Are they available on your publisher's site?
I am self-published.
Aha.
Yes, I wrote my entire life, but I've worked with many publishers, and I wanted to get my books out quicker than I knew that they would be able to. So that's the route I went.
Yes, it's much faster to get books out self-published than it is to go the conventional route.
Definitely.
I'm not self-published, but I'm a believer in self-publishing.
Well, it's changed so much from what it used to be. It used to be just vanity press, but it's not like that anymore.
No,
and
not at all.
It's truly revolutionized how people read and have access to books.
Well, that's why it's called indie publishing now, to differentiate it from what self-publishing used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reading an interesting article the other day. They were talking about how many of the big publishers also have now what they're calling their self-publishing arm.
Yes.
And I thought that was kind of interesting because obviously they're recognizing that independent publishers are giving them a run for their money.
Well, and you have more control over your own book. I remember when I guess it was my 3rd book was published way back when, and it was published with one of the New York biggies, and they changed the title on me, and I told them that they were cutting out half their potential readership with the title change, and they insisted on it, and I had no say in the matter whatsoever. And the book bombed. The book absolutely bombed. And I'm convinced that if it had gone out with the title that I had put to it, it would have sold a lot better.
Interesting. Is there any way you can take it now and go through independent publishing and with your title?
There is, but I'm just not inclined to. There is, but I'm just not inclined to.
Yeah, I understand. I understand.
I have a bitter taste in my mouth over that one.
Yeah. I'm real excited. I have so many different ideas of things that I want to do. I've got 2 more in the American Revolution series. I've got Revolutionary Bride and Revolutionary C coming up. And Revolutionary C came out totally just from other research. Remember, I'd said don't ever throw anything away.
Yeah.
But I actually found a diary of somebody who had been a prisoner of war on a ship, and I thought I've got to let people know about this because it's something that nobody ever hears about, and I think it's very important to learn.
Well, Lori, thank you very much. Our time's up, but good luck with your books and good luck with your cooking and baking and your kitty cats, and hope to talk to you again. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Folks, remember that Crimson Cloak Publishing is your source for a wide variety of books, fiction, nonfiction, children's, adults. Don't forget to pass a smile along. I'll see you here next week, same time, and until then, be nice to each other. And like I said, pass a smile along. Bye-bye now.
You have been listening to In the Spotlight with your host, Cynthia McGregor, brought to you by Crimson Cloak Publishing. For a wide variety of books for both adults and children in print, ebook, and audio formats, join us every Tuesday at the same time as In the Spotlight brings you interesting guests who entertain and enlighten you. I'm Carly McCracken. On behalf of Crimson Cloak Publishing, thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next week.